March 28th, 193 AD, the Praetorian camp, Rome. The body of Emperor Pertinax was still warm when his killers decided to sell his job. The Praetorian Guard, 10,000 of Rome's most elite soldiers, sworn to protect the emperor with their lives, had just murdered their second master in 3 months, and now they stood atop the walls of their fortified camp and shouted an invitation into the Roman dusk. The throne was available to whoever would pay the most for it. Within the hour, 2 of Rome's wealthiest senators had arrived at the camp gates, and what followed was perhaps the most astonishing transaction in human history. Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, the dead emperor's father-in-law, stood inside the camp, already negotiating. But then came Didius Julianus, 60 years old, drunk on wine or ambition or both, pushing through the gathering crowd to shout his counterbid over the walls. The guards ran back and forth between the 2 men, like auctioneers at a cattle market, each offer topping the last, until Julianus raised his hand and called out the winning number, 25,000 sesterces for every soldier in the guard. The Praetorians threw open the gates, draped him in purple, and marched their purchased emperor to the Senate at sword point to be confirmed. He had just bought the Roman Empire. In 66 days it would cost him his head. Marcus Didius, Severus Julianus entered the world around 133 AD in Mediolanum, modern Milan, a prosperous city in the shadow of the Alps where northern Italian wealth met the administrative machinery of empire. His family was not Roman by blood, but by ambition, descendants of settlers from Hadrumetum in North Africa who had migrated north and married well. By the time of his birth, the DD had completed their transformation from provincial outsiders to established aristocracy, the kind of family that produced senators and governors and men whose names appeared on public buildings. But one name in the family tree towered above all others: Lucius Salvius Julianus, the boy's great-grandfather, perhaps the most celebrated legal mind Rome ever produced. Under Emperor Hadrian, Salvius Julianus had been commissioned to codify the edicts of the praetors into a single, permanent legal text, the Edictum Perpetuum, a work so authoritative that it would form the backbone of Roman law for centuries. To be a Julianus was to carry that legacy like a second inheritance, a reminder that the family had shaped the very rules by which the empire governed itself. The young Didius Julianus grew up in the long shadow of that achievement, educated in rhetoric and law, groomed from childhood to understand that his bloodline entitled him to power. His mother, Aemilia Clara, ensured he wanted for nothing. His father's early death only concentrated the family's resources and expectations onto his shoulders. The Empress Domitia Lucilla, mother of the future philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, took a particular interest in the boy. Whether through family connection, social maneuvering, or genuine affection, she became his patron in those crucial early years, and her influence opened doors that even money could not purchase. Through her household, young Julianus breathed the rarefied air of Rome's innermost circles, watching how power actually operated, not through laws and speeches, but through relationships, favors, and the careful cultivation of the right friendships. He learned that the empire was less a government than a network, and that a man's advancement depended not on merit alone, but on who would speak for him when positions were distributed. By his late teens, Julianus had absorbed the essential lesson of Roman aristocratic life. Talent might earn you a posting, but patronage determined whether that posting led anywhere. His first official positions came in the traditional sequence of the Cursus Honorum, the ladder of offices that every ambitious Roman was expected to climb. He served as a military tribune, likely in one of the Germanic frontier legions, where young aristocrats learned the realities of command, far from the comforts of Italy. The northern frontier in the mid-2nd century was no ceremonial posting. Germanic tribes pressed constantly against the Rhine and Danube, and the legions stationed there fought real campaigns in real winters against enemies who did not observe Roman rules of warfare. Whatever softness his wealthy upbringing might have instilled, the frontier burned away. He learned to issue order that sent men to die, to maintain discipline in frozen camps, to navigate the brutal politics of legion life where a tribune's authority meant nothing if the centurions did not respect him. He returned to Rome sometime in the 160s, his military credentials established, ready for the civilian offices that would cement his status. Questor, Aedile, Praetor. He checked each box with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the prizes went not to the brilliant, but to the persistent. His legal background served him well. His grandfather's name opened conversations. His wealth smoothed every transition. He was not, by any account, an exceptional man. No ancient source credits him with military genius, or oratorical brilliance, or philosophical depth. But he was capable, connected, and relentless in his pursuit of advancement. And in the Roman system, that was often enough. By the time Julianus entered his 30s, he had become exactly what his family had spent generations engineering. A senator of the middle rank, wealthy beyond common measure, positioned for the governorships and consulships that would define his mature career. He had survived the treacherous court of Antoninus Pius and navigated the early years of Marcus Aurelius without making enemies powerful enough to destroy him. He had married well, Manlia Scantilla, from another family of provincial origin and metropolitan ambition, and fathered a daughter, Didia Clara, who would one day briefly hold the title of Augusta, Empress of Rome. The Julianus family machine was functioning precisely as designed, converting money and connections into offices and honors with mechanical efficiency. What no one could have predicted, what Julianus himself could not have imagined as he climbed the conventional ladder of Roman success, was that all of this patient ambition was leading him toward a single, catastrophic moment of decision. Decades of preparation for power would culminate not in the dignified assumption of authority, but in a drunken shouting match outside a military camp, bidding against another man for the right to rule the world. The Golden Son of Mediolanum would get everything his family had ever wanted, and it would destroy him. The Roman Empire in the 160s was a paradox of unprecedented prosperity and looming catastrophe. Marcus Aurelius sat on the throne, the philosopher king whom Plato had dreamed of, and the imperial machinery hummed with bureaucratic efficiency. But beyond the frontiers, pressure was building. Germanic tribes massed along the Danube. Parthia stirred in the east, and in 165 AD, the legions returning from a victorious eastern campaign brought back something far more destructive than any barbarian horde. A plague that would eventually kill between 5 and 10 million people across the empire. Into this world of golden surfaces and rotting foundations, Didius Julianus launched the most ambitious phase of his career. His first major command came in Germania Inferior, the province hugging the lower Rhine, where Roman civilization ended and the endless forests began. This was not a reward, but a test. The Germanic frontier demanded governors who could manage both sword and ledger, defending against raids while keeping the legions paid, the roads maintained, and the tax revenues flowing back to Rome. Julianus proved adequate to the task. He was no Caesar, conquering new territories and writing elegant commentaries about his genius. But he kept the peace, balanced the books, and emerged with his reputation intact. In the Roman system, that counted as success. The emperor noticed. More importantly, the emperor's advisors noticed and began adding Julianus's name to the lists of men suitable for further advancement. The governorship of Dalmatia followed, then Bithynia in Asia Minor, each posting larger and more lucrative than the last. Julianus was becoming wealthy in ways that even his inherited fortune could not have provided. Provincial governors in the Roman system occupied a gray zone between public service and licensed extraction. A careful man could enrich himself enormously while staying just within the bounds of acceptable corruption. Julianus was careful. He cultivated relationships with local elites, adjudicated disputes with enough fairness to prevent revolts, and ensured that Rome received its expected revenues while his own coffers quietly swelled. The provinces he governed remembered him as neither a hero nor a villain, simply as another in the endless procession of Roman administrators who came, extracted, and departed. But it was his tenure in Germania that revealed the quality that would define his character: a talent for surviving political storms that destroyed other men. Sometime during his northern command, Julianus uncovered what he believed was a conspiracy against Marcus Aurelius's co-emperor, Lucius Verus. The details remain murky. Ancient sources offer only fragments, but Julianus reportedly exposed the plot, earning the gratitude of the imperial household and demonstrating a crucial skill for any Roman politician: knowing when to inform on potential rivals. In an empire where treason charges could materialize from nothing and destroy entire families overnight, the ability to position oneself on the right side of accusations was worth more than military victories. Julianus had shown he understood this arithmetic of survival. The consulship came in 175 AD, the summit of ordinary ambition. To hold the fasces, to give one's name to the year, to sit in the curule chair where Cicero and Caesar had sat, this was what generations of Juliani had labored toward. Didius Julianus, now in his early 40s, had achieved everything his family's money and connections had been designed to purchase. He was a consular, a man of the highest senatorial rank, entitled to the best seats at the games and the most prominent positions in any ceremonial procession. His daughter Didia Clara was approaching marriageable age, her prospects enhanced immeasurably by her father's status. His wife Manlia Scantilla presided over one of Rome's finest households. By any conventional measure, the Julianus family had arrived. Yet the consulship also marked the beginning of a more dangerous phase. Below the consular rank, a senator could maintain a comfortable anonymity, pursuing wealth and status without attracting the lethal attention of emperors. Above it, visibility became inescapable. Every consular was a potential rival to the throne, and emperors, even wise ones like Marcus Aurelius, watched their most prominent subjects with wary eyes. The same connections that had propelled Julianus upward now made him a target. He had spent decades learning to navigate the currents of Roman politics. Now he would discover that the waters near the top were filled with sharks. The years following his consulship brought continued advancement, but also the first hints of the danger that came with prominence. He governed Africa Proconsularis, one of the empire's wealthiest provinces, responsible for the grain shipments that fed Rome itself. He was appointed to prestigious priesthoods, given commands that kept him visible without making him threatening. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, succeeded by his unstable son Commodus, and suddenly the rules of the game changed entirely. The philosopher king had valued competence and loyalty. Commodus valued flattery and submission, and he possessed a paranoid streak that would eventually consume dozens of prominent Romans in treason trials both real and manufactured. Julianus watched as colleagues he had known for decades were accused, tried, and executed on charges that ranged from plausible to absurd. He saw fortunes confiscated, families destroyed, reputations built over lifetimes shattered by a single imperial whim. And he adapted. Whatever personal feelings he harbored about Commodus's increasingly erratic rule, he kept them buried behind a mask of obedient competence. He paid his bribes, attended his ceremonies, and avoided the fatal mistake of appearing too capable or too ambitious. For 12 years, as Commodus descended further into megalomania, renaming Rome after himself, fighting as a gladiator in the arena, declaring himself the incarnation of Hercules, Didius Julianus survived. It was an ugly kind of survival, the survival of a man who had learned to bow at precisely the right angle and smile at precisely the right moments. But it was survival, nonetheless, and in the Roman Empire of the 180s, that was no small achievement. Dozens of senators who had entered Commodus's reign with brighter reputations and greater accomplishments than Julianus did not live to see its end. He did. The question that no one, perhaps not even Julianus himself, could answer was whether this talent for survival reflected wisdom or cowardice, prudence or the absence of any conviction worth dying for. The answer would come soon enough. On New Year's Eve of 192 AD, Commodus was strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, part of a conspiracy that included his own chamberlain and mistress. The mad emperor was dead. And Didius Julianus, 60 years old and richer than he had ever been, suddenly found himself in a Rome where everything he had spent a lifetime learning no longer applied. The game was about to change completely, and this time, survival would require something more than knowing when to bow. The conspiracy that killed Commodus had a replacement ready before the body was cold. Publius Helvius Pertinax, a 66-year-old senator with an impeccable military record and a reputation for incorruptibility, was roused from his bed on New Year's Eve and informed that he was now Emperor of Rome. By dawn on January 1st, 193 AD, the Praetorian Guard had been bribed into acceptance. The Senate had confirmed the appointment with tearful relief, and Rome had awakened to something it had not experienced in over a decade: hope. But Didius Julianus was not in Rome to witness it. Sometime in the final, chaotic years of Commodus's reign, he had fallen under suspicion, accused of involvement in yet another conspiracy, whether real or invented by the emperor's informers. The punishment was exile to his hometown of Mediolanum, a sentence that sounds mild but carried the weight of professional death. For a Roman senator, exile meant exclusion from the only world that mattered: the courts, the Senate house, the endless dinner parties where careers were made and unmade. Julianus had spent 40 years climbing toward the center of power. Now he found himself cast back to the provincial city of his birth, watching from a distance as history happened without him. The sources are frustratingly vague about this period. How long did the exile last? What specific charges had triggered it? Did Julianus genuinely plot against Commodus, or was he simply caught in the paranoid emperor's ever-widening net of suspicion? We do not know. What we do know is that Julianus survived, again, and that his survival likely owed something to the very obscurity that exile imposed. Commodus's executioners focused on threats close at hand, senators who whispered in the corridors of the palace and dined with the emperor's enemies in Rome. A disgraced politician sulking in Milan hardly seemed worth the effort of a formal trial. The strangling of Commodus changed everything. Pertinax, upon assuming power, immediately began rehabilitating those who had suffered under the previous regime. Exiles were recalled, confiscated properties were returned. Senators who had spent years in terrified silence suddenly found themselves free to speak, and they spoke with the pent-up fury of men who had watched friends and colleagues die for crimes that existed only in a madman's imagination. Julianus was among those restored, his property and dignities returned, his place in the Senate reclaimed. At 60 years old, he had been given something that Roman politics rarely offered: a second chance. He used it carefully. The Rome that Julianus returned to in early 193 AD was a city balanced between euphoria and terror, desperate to believe that the nightmare was over but haunted by the knowledge of how quickly things could turn. Pertinax embodied the hope: a stern, upright administrator who promised fiscal responsibility, military discipline, and an end to the corruption that had metastasized under Commodus. He slashed imperial expenditures. He auctioned off Commodus's grotesque collection of luxury goods. He promised the Praetorian Guard a donative of 12,000 sesterces per man, a generous sum that nonetheless fell short of what they had grown accustomed to receiving from the previous emperor. This was where Pertinax's admirable principles collided with political reality. The Praetorian Guard had become, over the course of the previous century, something far more dangerous than a mere bodyguard unit. They were kingmakers, 10,000 armed men stationed in the heart of the capital, with the power to elevate or eliminate emperors at will. Commodus had understood this and kept them happy with lavish donatives and relaxed discipline. Pertinax, the reformer, saw them as part of the problem, overpaid, under-disciplined, and far too accustomed to dictating terms to their supposed masters. He intended to bring them to heel. Julianus watched these developments with the calculating eye of a man who had survived decades of imperial politics. He saw Pertinax's virtues clearly enough. The new emperor was honest, capable, and genuinely committed to restoring the empire's finances. But he also saw the danger. Pertinax was moving too fast, demanding too much, making enemies of precisely the men who had the power to destroy him. The Praetorians grumbled about their reduced donative. They complained about new restrictions on their privileges. They whispered that this emperor was no better than a miser, that they had made a mistake in accepting him, that perhaps a change was needed. On January 3rd, barely 2 days into the new reign, a group of soldiers attempted to proclaim a senator named Triarius Maternus as emperor. The plot failed. Maternus himself refused the purple, and Pertinax pardoned the conspirators with a clemency that his advisors warned was dangerously naive. 3 weeks later, another group of Praetorians marched on the palace in an attempted coup that was turned back only at the last moment. Pertinax again chose mercy over punishment, executing only the ringleaders and hoping that moderation would purchase loyalty. It would not. Julianus, along with every other experienced senator in Rome, could see that Pertinax was living on borrowed time. The emperor had alienated the only men capable of protecting him while refusing to take the ruthless measures necessary to neutralize them. It was a textbook case of political suicide in slow motion, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The question was not whether Pertinax would fall, but when, and what would happen afterward. Julianus began, perhaps unconsciously, to position himself. He cultivated friendships among the Praetorian officers, not conspicuously enough to attract suspicion, but enough to ensure that his name was known in the camp. He let it be understood that he was a man of wealth and generosity, the sort of patron who remembered his friends when fortune smiled upon him. He attended Senate meetings with appropriate gravity, supported Pertinax's reforms with appropriate enthusiasm, and waited. After 60 years of climbing and surviving and waiting, he had developed an almost preternatural patience. Whatever was coming, he intended to be ready for it. The end came on March 28th, 86 days after Pertinax had assumed the purple. A group of roughly 300 Praetorians, inflamed by grievances real and imagined, marched from their camp to the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. Pertinax, informed of their approach, made a final miscalculation. Instead of fleeing or summoning loyal troops, he went out to meet them personally, believing that the force of his authority and the righteousness of his cause would turn them back. He was still speaking when the first spear struck him. The soldiers fell upon their emperor in a frenzy, stabbing him dozens of times, then hacked off his head and mounted it on a pole. The reformer who had promised to restore Rome's dignity died in a courtyard of the palace he had occupied for less than 3 months, murdered by the men he had tried to discipline. When word reached Julianus, he was dining at his home, surrounded by family and friends. The messenger brought chaos. The emperor was dead, the Praetorians had retreated to their camp, and, most astonishing of all, they were offering the throne to whoever would pay the highest price for it. His wife Manlia Scantilla begged him not to go. His daughter Didia Clara wept. His son-in-law, Cornelius Repentinus, urged caution. But Julianus was already rising from his couch, calling for his litter, his mind racing through calculations that a lifetime of Roman politics had prepared him to make. The Praetorians were offering the empire for sale. He had spent 60 years accumulating wealth, connections, and experience for exactly such a moment. To hesitate now was to watch someone else seize the prize that fate had placed within his reach. He did not hesitate. To understand the magnitude of what Didius Julianus was about to purchase, one must first understand what had just been destroyed. Publius Helvius Pertinax was everything Commodus was not, and his murder represented the death of the last best chance to save Rome from itself. Pertinax had been born poor, the son of a freedman who sold wool in the hills of Liguria. In a society obsessed with bloodlines and inherited status, he had risen through sheer competence, clawing his way from provincial schoolteacher to military commander to senator to consul. He had fought on every frontier the empire possessed: Britain, Dacia, Syria, the Danube, and earned a reputation as the kind of general who shared his soldiers' hardships rather than observing them from a comfortable distance. Marcus Aurelius had valued him precisely because he owed his position to talent rather than birth. There was no network of aristocratic relatives whose interests might cloud his judgment, no inherited fortune that might make him soft. Pertinax was that rarest of Roman creatures, a self-made man in an empire that worshipped ancestry. When the conspirators came to him on New Year's Eve with the offer of the purple, Pertinax initially refused. He was 66 years old, had already achieved more than his father could have imagined, and understood better than most the dangers of supreme power. The throne that had just been vacated by violence would likely be vacated by violence again. This was the pattern of the previous century, and Pertinax had no illusions about his ability to break it. But the conspirators insisted. Rome needed a steady hand. The Senate would support him. The Praetorians had already been promised a donative. There was, they assured him, no real alternative. He accepted, and for 86 days, Rome glimpsed what competent government might look like. Pertinax's first acts were practical rather than theatrical. He opened Commodus's palace to inspection, revealing the grotesque excesses of the previous reign: the private gladiatorial arena, the menagerie of exotic animals, the warehouses of silk and silver accumulated through confiscation and extortion. He auctioned it all, channeling the proceeds into the depleted treasury. He reduced taxes where he could, eliminated sinecures that existed only to reward imperial favorites, and began the unglamorous work of balancing accounts that had been neglected for over a decade. The Senate, starved for respect after years of Commodus's contempt, responded with genuine enthusiasm. Here at last was an emperor who consulted them, who treated them as partners rather than props. But the Praetorian Guard saw something different. They saw an emperor who paid them less than his predecessor, who criticized their discipline, who seemed to value dusty senators more than the armed men who actually kept him alive. The donative Pertinax offered, 12,000 sesterces per soldier, was generous by historical standards, but insulting compared to what Commodus had provided. Worse, Pertinax made clear that he intended to restore traditional military discipline, ending the slack practices that had made Praetorian service such a comfortable posting. He wanted soldiers, not pampered household troops. The Guard wanted an emperor who understood his place. The first conspiracy emerged within 48 hours. A faction of Praetorians attempted to proclaim Triarius Maternus emperor on January 3rd, marching to his house to offer him the purple. Maternus, either from loyalty or prudence, refused and immediately reported the plot to Pertinax. The emperor's response revealed both his virtue and his vulnerability. He punished only the ringleaders and pardoned the rest, hoping that mercy would inspire gratitude. It inspired only contempt. the soldiers learned that attempted treason carried minimal consequences. 3 weeks later, a larger group tried again. Several hundred Praetorians marched on the Palatine, reaching the palace itself before being turned back by a combination of loyal guards and Pertinax's personal intervention. Again, the emperor chose clemency. Again, his advisors warned him that he was teaching the guard that rebellion was a low-risk proposition. Pertinax waved away their concerns. He had spent his career leading men, and he believed that firm but fair treatment would eventually win the soldiers' respect. He did not have eventually. He had weeks. The fatal conspiracy coalesced around a Praetorian officer named Laetus, the same man who had helped organize Commodus's assassination. Laetus had expected to be the power behind the new throne, the indispensable advisor who guided the elderly emperor through the complexities of court politics. Instead, Pertinax had sidelined him, preferring to make his own decisions and choose his own counselors. A man who had risked everything to make an emperor discovered that the emperor felt no particular obligation to him. Laetus began talking to the other disaffected officers. The conversations grew more specific. A date was chosen. On the morning of March 28th, approximately 300 soldiers left the Praetorian camp and marched toward the Palatine. They encountered no resistance. The urban cohorts that should have defended the city were either sympathetic or unwilling to fight fellow soldiers. The palace guards melted away as the mob approached. Pertinax, informed of the danger, could have fled through the warren of passages that honeycombed the Palatine complex. Instead, he walked out to meet his murderers. The ancient sources preserve what may be his final words, a speech appealing to the soldiers' oath of loyalty, their honor as Roman troops, their obligation to the empire they served. For a moment, the speech seemed to work. The soldiers hesitated, some lowering their weapons, uncertain whether they really intended to do what they had come to do. Then a Tungrian auxiliary named Tausius pushed through the crowd and hurled his spear. It struck Pertinax in the chest. The hesitation ended. The soldiers swarmed forward, stabbing and hacking at the fallen emperor, until there was nothing left to recognize. They cut off his head, mounted it on a lance, and carried it back to camp in triumph. Behind them, they left an empire without a ruler, a senate paralyzed by terror, and a city that had just witnessed the violent death of its second emperor in 3 months. The soldiers had demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that they were the true masters of Rome. Now they would determine who came next. What followed was unprecedented in Roman history. Not a succession, not a civil war, but a sale. The Praetorians gathered in their camp and sent messengers into the city with an announcement that beggared belief. The Roman Empire was available for purchase. Whoever offered the highest donative to the guard would receive their support and, with it, the throne. The asking price was the accumulated wealth of whatever fool believed he could buy the loyalty of men who had just murdered 2 emperors. Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, Pertinax's father-in-law, was already in the camp when the announcement went out. He had been sent there by Pertinax earlier that day to calm the soldiers, unaware that his mission of peace was about to become an auction. When the guard declared its intentions, Sulpicianus recognized that flight would mean death and began negotiating. He offered 20,000 sesterces per man, a fortune that would drain even his considerable resources. The soldiers listened, calculated, and waited to see if anyone would offer more. Someone did. Across the city, Didius Julianus received word of the auction and made the decision that would immortalize him in the worst possible way. He called for his litter, ignored his family's pleas, and set off through the darkening streets toward the Praetorian camp. Behind him, Rome held its breath. Ahead of him, the greatest empire the world had ever known waited to be sold to the highest bidder. The Palatine Hill on the morning of March 28th was quiet in the way that only imperial residences can be. A silence maintained by hundreds of slaves and functionaries who had learned that the emperor's peace was not to be disturbed. Pertinax had risen early, as was his habit, attended to correspondence, and was preparing for the day's audiences when a freedman burst into his chambers with news that emptied the blood from every face in the room. Soldiers were coming, not a delegation, not a petition. An armed mob marching from the Praetorian camp with weapons drawn and murder in their eyes. The palace erupted into controlled panic. Chamberlains rushed to secure documents. Slaves pressed themselves against walls, calculating escape routes. The Praetorian tribunes, on duty, the very officers responsible for the emperor's safety, received the reports with expressions that suggested they were not entirely surprised by this development. Pertinax had roughly 1 hour to decide how he would meet his death. He could have run. The Palatine complex was a labyrinth of corridors, hidden passages, and forgotten rooms accumulated over 2 centuries of imperial construction. A man who knew its secrets could disappear into its depths and emerge miles away, outside the city walls, with a chance of reaching loyal legions in the provinces. Pertinax's advisors begged him to flee. His chamberlain Eclectus, the same man who had helped orchestrate Commodus's assassination, offered to guide him through the tunnels personally. The urban prefect could buy time, delay the soldiers at the outer gates while the emperor escaped to fight another day. Pertinax refused. The sources disagree on whether this reflected courage, fatalism, or simply a miscalculation born of decades commanding troops. He had talked down mutinies before, faced hostile soldiers with nothing but the authority of his office and the force of his personality. Perhaps he believed he could do so again. Perhaps he simply could not stomach the image of a Roman emperor fleeing through sewage tunnels like a common criminal. Whatever his reasoning, he ordered his attendants to open the gates and walked out to meet the men who had come to kill him. The soldiers had entered the palace grounds virtually unopposed. The Praetorian cohorts, technically responsible for guarding the complex, had either joined the conspirators or simply stepped aside. Professional soldiers making professional calculations about which side was likely to win. A few loyal guardsmen attempted to form a defensive line and were cut down immediately, their bodies left bleeding on the marble floors as the mob pushed deeper into the complex. By the time Pertinax emerged to confront them, the soldiers had already tasted blood. He stood before them in the courtyard, an old man in a toga, facing 300 armed killers, and began to speak. The ancient historian, Cassius Dio, writing a generation later, preserved the substance if not the exact words. Pertinax reminded them of their oaths, of the dignity of their office, of the shame they would bring upon themselves and the guard by murdering the emperor they had sworn to protect. He invoked the gods, the traditions of Rome, the judgment of history. He offered even now to negotiate, to address whatever grievances had driven them to this extremity. For a moment, impossibly, it seemed to work. The soldiers in the front ranks hesitated. Some lowered their weapons. The fury that had carried them from camp to palace began to waver as the reality of what they were about to do pressed against the abstraction that had seemed so simple an hour before. Killing an emperor was one thing when discussed over wine in the barracks. Killing this particular old man, who stood before them without weapon or armor, asking only to be heard, that was something else. Then Tausius pushed his way to the front. He was a Tungrian, a soldier from the auxiliary units recruited in what is now Belgium, and he had not marched all this way to listen to speeches. Before anyone could stop him, before perhaps he could stop himself, he hurled his spear. It struck Pertinax below the collarbone, staggering him backward. The emperor's hand went to the wound, came away red. The spell broke. The hesitant soldiers became a mob once more, surging forward with swords drawn. Pertinax fell under a storm of blows, stabbed so many times that the ancient sources do not even attempt to count. He was dead within seconds, but the soldiers kept hacking at his body, his face, his limbs, until what remained bore no resemblance to anything human. When the frenzy finally exhausted itself, someone produced a sword sharp enough to sever the neck cleanly. The emperor's head was mounted on a lance. The procession that followed was a grotesque parody of a triumphal march. The soldiers carried Pertinax's head through the streets of Rome, past temples and markets, and the homes of terrified citizens who barred their doors and prayed for the madness to pass. They chanted slogans, laughed at their own daring, drunk on the intoxicating realization that they had just done the unthinkable and the sky had not fallen. By the time they reached the Praetorian camp, they had convinced themselves that they had not merely committed murder, but achieved liberation. The miser was dead. Now it was time to find someone more generous. The gates of the camp closed behind them, and the soldiers gathered to consider their next move. They had eliminated an emperor. Now they needed to create one. The traditional path, consultation with the Senate, consideration of candidates, formal investiture, held no appeal for men who had just demonstrated their contempt for traditional authority. They wanted an emperor who would understand, from his first moment on the throne, exactly who had put him there, and exactly what he owed them. They wanted an emperor they could control. The solution emerged with a speed that suggested it had been discussed beforehand, perhaps even planned as part of the original conspiracy. The guard would sell the throne to whoever offered the best price. The transaction would be explicit, the terms clear, the debt unpayable in anything other than continued subservience. Whichever senator purchased the purple would know that his power rested entirely on Praetorian goodwill, and that the same men who had killed Pertinax would kill him too if he ever forgot the nature of their arrangement. Messengers went out into the city, the Roman Empire, rulers of the Mediterranean world, masters of 60 million souls, heirs to 5 centuries of military and administrative genius, was officially for sale. Sulpicianus was already in the camp, trapped by circumstances into becoming the first bidder. But even as he began his negotiations, word was spreading through the streets of Rome. In a dining room across the city, Didius Julianus heard the news and rose from his couch. His wife begged him to stay. His daughter wept at his feet. He went anyway. The auction of the world was about to begin, and he intended to win it. The streets between Julianus's home and the Praetorian camp were a study in urban terror. Shops had shuttered at the first rumors of violence. Citizens who had ventured out for the day's business now pressed themselves into doorways, watching the armed patrols that moved through the city with the nervous alertness of men who knew they had crossed a line and were not yet certain of the consequences. Rome had seen coups before, seen emperors rise and fall, but this was something new. A murder without a successor, a throne without a claimant, an empire suspended in the space between one ruler and the next. Julianus's litter pushed through the chaos, borne by slaves who must have wondered if they were carrying their master to glory or to death. The old senator sat behind the curtains, his mind working through calculations that only a lifetime of Roman politics could have prepared him to make. Sulpicianus was already negotiating, already promising money that might secure the throne before Julianus could even reach the camp. But Sulpicianus was Pertinax's father-in-law, tainted by association with the man the soldiers had just murdered. That connection might weigh against him. It might provide an opening. The Praetorian camp, the Castra Praetoria, occupied a massive fortified rectangle on the northeastern edge of the city, its walls thick enough to withstand siege engines, its interior large enough to house 10,000 of Rome's most privileged soldiers. The camp had been built by the Emperor Tiberius a century and a half earlier, a deliberate consolidation of military power that his predecessor Augustus had carefully dispersed. Concentrating the guard in a single fortress had made them easier to control. It had also made them easier to organize for exactly the kind of action they had just undertaken. Julianus arrived at the walls as dusk gathered, the spring evening cooling rapidly, torches beginning to flicker along the ramparts. He could hear the noise from within, thousands of voices, the clatter of equipment, occasional cheers whose meaning he could not yet decipher. The gates were sealed, guarded by soldiers who watched the growing crowd outside with the bored menace of men who knew themselves to be untouchable. Sulpicianus was nowhere to be seen. He was already inside, already bidding. What happened next has the quality of theater, a scene so improbable that later historians would struggle to credit it. Julianus, denied entry through the gates, approached the walls themselves and began to shout. He called out to the soldiers on the ramparts, announced his identity, declared his intention to make an offer for the throne. The guards laughed at first. Here was an old man yelling at a fortress, demanding to be allowed to bid on an empire as though it were a lot at a fish market. But they also listened, and when Julianus named a figure, 20,000 sesterces per man, matching what they had heard Sulpicianus was offering inside, they sent runners to inform the officers conducting the auction. The scene that developed would have been farcical if the stakes were not so deadly. Soldiers ran back and forth between Sulpicianus, negotiating in the camp's interior, and Julianus, shouting from outside the walls. Each bid was relayed, considered, and countered. Sulpicianus raised his offer. Julianus raised his. The amounts climbed past anything either man could reasonably afford, numbers so large they represented not actual wealth, but promises against future plunder, a claim on the imperial treasury that neither bidder yet controlled. The soldiers treated the spectacle with the appreciative attention of men watching a particularly entertaining gladiatorial match. They cheered each escalation, jeered when a bidder hesitated, offered helpful suggestions about how much more each man might be able to afford. The fate of the Roman world was being determined by the same dynamics that governed the purchase of slaves or livestock, and the men conducting the sale saw nothing inappropriate in this. They had power, and power was worth whatever someone would pay for it. Julianus understood that he was losing. Sulpicianus had the advantage of physical presence, the ability to make his case directly to the officers who would ultimately decide. From outside the walls, Julianus could only shout numbers, unable to deploy the personal charm and political sophistication that had carried him through 4 decades of Roman politics. He needed to change the game. He raised his hand and called out a figure that silenced the ramparts. 25,000 sesterces per man. The mathematics were staggering. The Praetorian Guard comprised roughly 10,000 soldiers. At 25,000 sesterces each, Julianus was promising 250 million sesterces, a sum that exceeded the annual tax revenue of entire provinces that would require either impossible taxation or the wholesale confiscation of senatorial estates to fulfill. It was not, in any realistic sense, a promise he could keep. But realism was not the point. The soldiers wanted to know which bidder would go furthest, would commit most completely, would demonstrate through the sheer size of his offer that he understood the nature of the transaction. Inside the camp, Sulpicianus heard the figure and faced an impossible choice. He could match the bid, committing himself to a debt that would destroy him financially whether he won or lost. He could exceed it, entering a spiral of escalation that could only end in numbers so absurd that even the soldiers might recognize them as fantasy. Or he could withdraw, conceding the throne to a rival while consoling himself that at least he would retain his wealth, and possibly his life. He hesitated. Perhaps he calculated odds. Perhaps he simply lost his nerve at the crucial moment. Whatever the reason, Titus Flavius Sulpicianus fell silent, and in that silence, Didius Julianus won the Roman Empire. The gates swung open. Soldiers streamed out to escort the victor inside. Their mood transformed instantly from suspicious hostility to enthusiastic welcome. Julianus entered the camp on foot, surrounded by guards who had murdered their last 2 employers, and received the acclamation that formally made him emperor. The soldiers draped him in the purple cloak of imperial authority. They hailed him with the ancient formula: Imperator Caesar, Didius Julianus Augustus. They raised him on a shield in the Germanic tradition, carrying him on their shoulders through the camp while thousands of voices shouted his name. It was everything generations of Giuliani had worked toward: absolute power, supreme authority, the throne of the Caesars. And it had been purchased in a transaction that made a mockery of every principle Rome claimed to represent. Julianus, who had spent a lifetime accumulating the credentials of legitimate authority, had obtained the ultimate prize through a process that invalidated the very concept of legitimacy. He was emperor because he had promised the largest bribe, and everyone involved knew it. The soldiers escorted their purchased emperor from the camp toward the Senate House, where the remaining formalities awaited. The march through Rome's streets was a torchlit procession of armed men surrounding a 60-year-old senator who had just bet everything he had, his fortune, his family, his life, on a proposition that only looked more insane the closer one examined it. The guard had killed Commodus. They had killed Pertinax. They would kill Julianus too, the moment he stopped being useful or started being inconvenient. The throne he had purchased came with an expiration date, and the men who had sold it to him were already calculating when to collect their next payment. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Didius Julianus was emperor of Rome. The Senate would confirm him because armed soldiers would leave them no choice. The people would accept him because they lacked the power to refuse. The legions in the provinces were another matter entirely. As Julianus rode toward his hollow triumph, messengers were already galloping toward Syria, toward Britain, toward the Danube frontier. The news they carried would set in motion forces that all the money in the world could not stop. Somewhere on the Pannonian frontier, a general named Septimius Severus received word of what had happened in Rome. He did not congratulate the new emperor. He began assembling his legions. The Senate convened an emergency session as the torches guttered toward midnight. The Curia Julia, that ancient hall where Cicero had thundered against Catiline and Caesar, had fallen beneath senatorial daggers, now hosted a very different kind of drama. 600 men in togas filing into their seats, while Praetorian guardsmen lined the walls with hands resting on sword hilts. The message required no interpretation. The Senate would confirm Didius Julianus as emperor, or the Senate would discover what happened to institutions that defied armed men. The formal proceedings maintained a thin pretense of constitutional propriety. Julianus addressed the assembled senators with the traditional modesty expected of a new emperor, praising his predecessor, carefully omitting the circumstances of Pertinax's death, promising fiscal responsibility and respect for senatorial privilege, outlining a program of moderate reform that would have sounded reasonable from any legitimate ruler. He spoke well. 40 years of political experience had made him fluent in the language of Roman governance, and the senators listened with the frozen attention of men calculating their survival odds in real time. The vote was unanimous. Of course it was. The senators who had genuinely supported Pertinax kept their mouths shut. The senators who despised Julianus for buying what they believed should be earned kept their mouths shut. The senators who might have preferred Sulpicianus, or Niger in Syria, or Severus on the Danube, all kept their mouths shut. The Praetorians had demonstrated with brutal clarity what happened to emperors who lost their support. The senators had no intention of discovering what happened to legislators who voted the wrong way. Julianus emerged from the Curia as legitimate emperor of Rome. Confirmed by the Senate, acclaimed by the Guard, invested with all the titles and authorities that 2 centuries of imperial precedent could provide. He processed through the Forum toward the Palatine, past temples to gods who had watched Rome transform from republic to empire, past monuments to conquests that had built the greatest power the Mediterranean world had ever known. The torchlight caught the gold thread in his purple cloak, threw flickering shadows across the faces of his escort. To a stranger arriving in Rome that night, he might have looked like any other emperor taking possession of his inheritance. But Rome was no stranger to itself. The city had watched Julianus negotiate for the throne, had heard the bidding shouted over the camp walls, had understood with perfect clarity what kind of a transaction had just occurred. When Julianus's procession entered the popular neighborhoods, the response was not cheers, but silence. The dangerous silence of a crowd withholding the approval that emperors required. A few voices called out insults. Others threw vegetables, stopping just short of the stones that would have demanded military response. The Praetorians tightened their formation around the emperor, hands moving to weapons, but Julianus waved them back. He understood that killing Roman citizens on the first night of his reign would only confirm what everyone already suspected about the nature of his authority. The imperial palace received him with the hollow grandeur of spaces designed for legitimate power. Slaves prostrated themselves. Officials presented themselves for instruction. The machinery of empire, correspondence, petitions, appointments, judicial appeals, awaited his attention as though nothing unusual had occurred. Julianus moved through the rituals with the practiced ease of a man who had observed imperial households for decades, issuing orders, accepting obeisances, playing the role of emperor with superficial competence. His wife Manlia Scantilla and daughter Didia Clara were summoned to the palace, elevated overnight from senatorial family to imperial household, granted the title of Augusta that made them theoretically the most exalted women in the Roman world. Didia Clara, in particular, found herself thrust into a prominence she had never sought. At perhaps 25 years old, she was suddenly empress, depicted on coins, invoked in prayers, addressed with honorifics that had belonged, mere hours before, to murdered Pertinax's wife. The transition had the quality of fever dream. Everything familiar suddenly transformed into something strange and threatening. She and her mother moved through the palace's labyrinthine corridors, attended by slaves who bowed too deeply and officials who smiled too broadly, and understood without needing to be told that they had entered a cage whose bars were made of gold and silk and the swords of the men who had put them there. The first full day of Julianus's reign brought a reckoning that all the ceremony could not disguise. He summoned his financial advisors to assess the state of the treasury that was now theoretically his to command. The news was catastrophic. Pertinax had inherited an empire drained by Commodus's excesses and had spent his brief reign trying to rebuild reserves through painful economy. The treasury contained nowhere near enough to pay the donative Julianus had promised. The 250 million sesterces he had pledged existed only as an abstraction, a number shouted over camp walls in the desperate arithmetic of an auction. Converting that abstraction into actual coins would require measures that would destroy his reign before it properly began. He could raise taxes, squeezing a population already burdened by Commodus's extractions and the ongoing economic disruptions of plague and frontier warfare. He could confiscate senatorial estates, turning the class that provided imperial administrators into enemies with nothing left to lose. He could debase the currency, reducing the silver content of coins and triggering the inflation that would eventually hollow out Roman economic life. Or he could default on his promise, informing the Praetorians that the winning bid in their auction had been a lie, and learning firsthand how they dealt with emperors who disappointed them. Julianus chose a combination of all four approaches, each one inadequate, each one generating new problems faster than it solved old ones. He began paying the donative in installments, promising the balance would follow as revenues materialized. The Praetorians accepted the partial payment with ill-concealed suspicion, their enthusiasm for their purchased emperor cooling with each day the full amount remained unpaid. The soldiers had entered into what they considered a business transaction. Julianus's inability to honor his side of the deal looked increasingly like fraud. The people of Rome, meanwhile, made their feelings known with increasing boldness. When Julianus appeared at the Circus Maximus for the traditional games that new emperors sponsored, the crowd greeted him with jeers, catcalls, and chants praising Pescennius Niger, the governor of Syria, whom rumor had already identified as a potential rival. The emperor sat in the imperial box, surrounded by guards, watching his subjects express their contempt with the safety of numbers. He could not punish 100,000 people. He could not win their love through spectacle while the circumstances of his elevation remained fresh in memory. He could only endure, smiling the fixed smile of a man pretending not to notice his own humiliation. At night, the palace that should have represented the pinnacle of human ambition became a prison of anxiety. Julianus posted guards at every entrance, every corridor, every window large enough for an assassin to enter. He varied his sleeping quarters randomly, never spending consecutive nights in the same room. He tasted nothing that had not been tested by others first. The man who had purchased the Roman Empire discovered that he had also purchased sleepless nights, paranoid days, and the constant awareness that the same transaction that had elevated him could be repeated at any moment with any bidder willing to pay more. And across the empire, the news was spreading. Messengers carried word of the auction to every province, every legion, every general who might consider himself more deserving than a 60-year-old senator, who had bought what they believed should be earned through blood and conquest. The Roman world was about to deliver its verdict on the sale of the purple. It would not be a favorable review. The honeymoon lasted approximately 3 days. By the first week of April, Didius Julianus had become the most despised man in Rome, not for tyranny, not for cruelty, but for the simple sin of having purchased what Romans believed should be earned. The city that had tolerated Caligula's madness and Nero's excesses and Commodus's gladiatorial fantasies found itself unable to stomach an emperor whose only crime was paying too much for the privilege of ruling them. The hostility manifested in ways large and small, a constant drumbeat of contempt that followed Julianus wherever he went. When he walked through the forum, citizens turned their backs. When his litter passed through the streets, voices called out prices, 25,000. As though he were a commodity still being auctioned, graffiti appeared on walls throughout the city, mocking verses and crude drawings depicting the emperor as a merchant, a prostitute, a fool who had mistaken gold for legitimacy. The urban poor, who had no stake in senatorial politics and no particular attachment to Pertinax, nevertheless understood instinctively that something shameful had occurred. An emperor was supposed to be chosen by the gods, or by the legions, or by the Senate, not purchased like an amphorae of wine. The Circus Maximus became the arena for Rome's collective verdict. Chariot races were more than entertainment. They were one of the few venues where ordinary citizens could express political opinions without fear of immediate reprisal. When Julianus appeared for the games in mid-April, the crowd of 200,000 turned the event into a demonstration. They chanted for Pescennius Niger, the popular governor of Syria, whose reputation for military competence and personal integrity made him everything Julianus was not. They threw food at the imperial box. They refused to watch the races, instead facing the emperor and shouting their contempt until their voices gave out. Julianus sat through it all, his face a mask of imperial composure, his guards positioned to intervene if the demonstration crossed from insult to assault. He could not respond to the crowd's hostility with force. Massacring Roman citizens at the games would confirm every accusation against him. He could not respond with persuasion. No speech could undo what everyone had witnessed. He could only endure, returning to the palace each evening to face reports that the provinces were responding to news of his elevation with even less enthusiasm than the capital. The financial crisis deepened with each passing week. Julianus had promised the Praetorians a donative that the treasury could not pay, and his attempts to raise the necessary funds created cascading disasters. He increased taxes on the wealthy, generating senatorial resentment without producing sufficient revenue. He attempted to confiscate the estates of condemned criminals, only to discover that Commodus had already stripped most of the obvious targets. He debased the currency slightly, reducing silver content in ways that merchants immediately noticed and adjusted their prices to reflect. Every solution created new problems. Every problem demanded solutions that generated additional enemies. The Praetorian Guard, whose support was the only thing keeping Julianus on the throne, grew increasingly restive as the promised payments failed to materialize. The soldiers had entered into what they considered a binding contract, and the emperor's inability to fulfill his obligations looked increasingly like a breach of faith. Grumbling spread through the barracks. Officers who had enthusiastically supported Julianus's bid began distancing themselves from his regime. The same men who had carried him through the camp on their shields now speculated openly about how much the next bidder might offer. Julianus responded to the military threat by attempting to cultivate personal relationships with Praetorian officers, hosting dinners at the palace, and distributing gifts to influential centurions. These gestures might have worked for an emperor with other sources of legitimacy. For Julianus, they simply reinforced the transactional nature of his authority. He was not building loyalty, but renting it, and everyone involved understood that rental agreements could be terminated when better offers arrived. The Senate, meanwhile, maintained a posture of correct hostility that stopped just short of open defiance. Senators attended sessions when required, voted as directed, and performed the ceremonial functions that imperial government demanded. But they offered nothing beyond the minimum. No enthusiasm, no voluntary cooperation, no genuine support for an emperor they regarded as an embarrassment to their class. Julianus had risen through senatorial ranks for 40 years. He knew these men, had dined with them, had competed with them for offices and honors. Now they looked through him as though he were a stranger, their contempt more painful for being expressed through omission rather than confrontation. The emperor's domestic life offered no refuge from the mounting pressures. Manlia, Scantilla, and Didia Clara occupied their new positions with visible discomfort, attending ceremonies and receiving petitioners, while understanding that their elevation depended entirely on circumstances that could change without warning. Didia Clara's husband, Cornelius Repentinus, received appointments that should have cemented the family's position. Julianus made him prefect of the city, but these honors felt less like rewards than hostages to fortune. Every benefit the regime conferred became another reason for its enemies to target the recipients. By late April, Julianus had begun to exhibit the paranoid behaviors that characterized emperors who sensed their grip on power weakening. He consulted astrologers and soothsayers, seeking reassurance that the stars favored his reign. He reportedly participated in magical rituals, sacrificing animals, and perhaps performing darker ceremonies in attempts to bind fortune to his cause. Whether these accounts reflect reality or hostile propaganda, the ancient sources were uniformly unfriendly to Julianus. They capture the desperation of a man who had acquired everything he ever wanted and discovered that it was slipping through his fingers. The palace itself became a fortress within a fortress. Julianus reinforced the Palatine's defenses, positioning guards at checkpoints throughout the complex, establishing protocols for screening visitors that made audience with the emperor a logistical ordeal. He rarely ventured into the city, conducting business from chambers that could be sealed and defended if necessary. The man who had governed provinces and commanded respect across the empire now ruled from a gilded bunker, issuing decrees that fewer people obeyed with each passing day. Reports from the provinces confirmed his worst fears. Pescennius Niger, the governor of Syria, had accepted acclamation from his legions and was preparing to march on Rome. Clodius Albinus in Britain was making similar noises. his 3 legions a potential threat if he chose to cross the Channel. And most dangerous of all, Septimius Severus, commander of the largest army on the Danube frontier, positioned closer to Rome than any other rival, had declared himself emperor and was already on the move. The auction had attracted exactly the response that any realistic observer should have predicted. The Praetorians had demonstrated that the throne could be purchased by whoever offered the highest price. Now, 3 generals with armies at their backs were preparing to make counteroffers. The currency they would use was not gold, but steel, and the transaction would be settled not in a camp courtyard, but on battlefields across the empire. Julianus had 66 days. The countdown had begun, and with each passing hour, the man who bought Rome discovered just how little his purchase actually included. The news arrived in fragments, each dispatch worse than the last. By mid-April, Julianus understood that his reign faced not 1 challenger, but 3. A tripartite threat emerging from the edges of the empire, like wolves circling a wounded animal. The auction that had made him emperor had also issued an invitation to every ambitious general in the Roman world. If the throne could be bought with money, it could be taken with swords. Pescennius Niger struck first, at least in terms of public declaration. The governor of Syria commanded 9 legions and controlled the wealthiest provinces in the empire, a tax base that made Julianus's treasury look like a provincial money changer's strongbox. Niger was everything the purchased emperor was not: a career soldier who had risen through merit, a commander beloved by his troops, a man whose claim to power rested on competence rather than coin. When word of the auction reached Antioch, his soldiers acclaimed him emperor with genuine enthusiasm, draping him in purple and hailing him as the avenger of Pertinax. The eastern Mediterranean, from Egypt to the Black Sea, rallied to his standard. Niger possessed advantage that should have made him the favorite. His provinces produced grain, textiles, and tax revenues in quantities that could fund years of civil war. His legions were hardened by constant conflict with Parthia, trained in the kind of large-scale operations that Italian garrison troops rarely experienced. The population of the East adored him, his reputation for personal modesty and incorruptibility, providing a stark contrast to the grotesque spectacle that had just occurred in Rome. When Niger announced his intention to march on the capital and restore legitimate government, millions believed him capable of delivering on the promise. But Niger had a fatal flaw. He was slow. Whether from excessive caution, insufficient preparation, or simple failure to grasp the urgency of the moment, he lingered in Syria while his rivals moved. He consolidated his position, secured his supply lines, waited for additional legions to join his standard. Every day he delayed was a day his competitors used to greater effect. The throne would not wait for the best qualified candidate. It would go to whoever seized it first. Clodius Albinus in Britain represented a different kind of threat, more distant but potentially decisive if he chose to intervene. The governor of Britannia commanded 3 legions on an island that had produced emperors before, troops who had spent generations fighting Caledonian tribes in conditions that made them among the toughest soldiers in the Roman army. Albinus himself came from aristocratic stock, his family credentials impeccable, his administrative record competent if unremarkable. He had ambition. That much was clear to anyone who had watched his career, but he also had a politician's instinct for waiting until the odds favored action. Albinus did not immediately declare himself emperor. Instead, he maintained a calculated ambiguity, accepting congratulations from his legions while avoiding explicit claims to the purple. He was watching, waiting to see how the conflict between Julianus and Niger developed, positioning himself to join whichever side offered the better terms, or to strike independently if both exhausted themselves in mutual destruction. Britain was far from Rome, insulated by the Channel and the long march through Gaul. but its legions represented a reserve force that could tip the balance at a crucial moment. Every player in the emerging civil war understood that Albinus's choice might ultimately determine the outcome. Then there was Septimius Severus. The governor of Pannonia Superior was 47 years old, a North African from Leptis Magna who had climbed the imperial hierarchy through a combination of military talent, political cunning, and the careful cultivation of powerful patrons. He commanded the Danubian legions, the largest concentration of military force in the empire, positioned along a frontier that stretched from modern Austria to the Black Sea. These were not parade ground soldiers or comfortable garrison troops. They were men who fought Germanic and Sarmatian raiders every campaigning season. Veterans of a permanent, low-intensity war that never quite ended and never quite allowed complacency. Severus understood something that neither Niger nor Albinus seemed to grasp. In a race for the throne, geography mattered more than legitimacy. Niger had more legions and more money, but he was 2,000 miles from Rome. Albinus had Britain's fierce warriors, but he was separated from the capital by the Channel and all of Gaul. Severus was 900 miles away, a march of perhaps 6 weeks for a motivated army traveling light. If he moved fast enough, he could reach Rome before either rival had crossed the Hellespont or the English Channel. He moved very fast indeed. Within days of learning about the auction, Severus had assembled his commanders and laid out his strategy. He would not wait for senatorial legitimacy or negotiate for Praetorian support. He would march on Rome with overwhelming force, presenting the capital with a fait accompli that neither Julianus nor the guard could resist. Once he held the city, he would deal with Niger and Albinus from a position of strength, using Rome's resources and symbolic authority to wage civil war as the legitimate emperor rather than as a provincial rebel. The Danubian legions acclaimed him with enthusiasm that reflected both genuine loyalty and calculated self-interest. Victory meant donatives, promotions, land grants, the rewards that soldiers had always extracted from emperors they helped create. Defeat meant death or disgrace. The men who followed Severus were not fighting for constitutional principles. They were making an investment in their commander's success and expected substantial returns. Severus's army began its march in mid-April, crossing the Julian Alps and descending into Italy before Julianus had fully grasped the scale of the threat. The speed was extraordinary. Severus drove his troops at a pace that averaged 25 miles per day, sacrificing baggage trains and siege equipment for velocity. He was not preparing for a prolonged campaign. He was executing a coup, racing to reach Rome before resistance could organize. Every city along the route faced a simple choice: open the gates or be destroyed. Most chose to open the gates. Reports of Severus's advance reached Rome in fragments that grew more alarming with each passing day. He had crossed the Alps. He was in Ravenna. He was approaching the Apennines. Each dispatch placed him closer to the capital, his army growing as Italian garrison troops defected to the winning side. The strategic situation that Julianus had assumed would give him months to consolidate his position had collapsed in weeks. The purchased emperor was about to learn the true price of his throne. In the palace, Julianus convened emergency councils that produced more panic than planning. His military options were limited to the point of non-existence. The Praetorian Guard was a garrison force, trained for ceremonial duties and urban policing rather than pitched battle against veteran legions. The Italian legions, theoretically loyal to Rome, were undermanned, under-equipped, and showed no particular enthusiasm for dying in defense of an emperor everyone knew had bought his position. The navy could perhaps delay Severus's advance if it remained loyal, but could not stop a land army. Julianus's advisors offered desperate suggestions: send assassins against Severus, bribe his officers to defect, negotiate an alliance with Niger or Albinus that might create a coalition against the common threat. Each proposal collapsed under examination. Assassins required access that Severus's security protocols prevented. Bribes required money that the treasury did not possess. Alliances required offering something of value to rivals who had no reason to save an emperor they despised. The auction had seemed, for one intoxicating evening, like the opportunity of a lifetime. Now Julianus could see it for what it truly was, a trap that had closed around him the moment he shouted his winning bid. He had purchased an empire that 3 armies were converging to take from him, using currency he could not spend in a transaction that every party except him understood to be temporary. Somewhere on the road from Pannonia, Septimius Severus drove his legions forward through the spring mud. He had perhaps 3 weeks of marching left. Julianus had perhaps 3 weeks of power left. The arithmetic was brutal, and both men knew it. Julianus had spent 60 years learning how Roman power worked. Now he discovered how quickly it could evaporate. The first desertion came from the fleet at Ravenna. The admiral, who commanded Rome's Adriatic naval forces, received word of Severus's approach, assessed his options, and concluded that the purchased emperor offered a poor return on loyalty. He transferred his allegiance to Severus without a battle, delivering the ships that might have interdicted the Danubian army's supply lines and providing the advancing general with his first major defection from the Italian military establishment. The dominoes had begun to fall. Julianus responded with a flurry of activity that revealed more desperation than strategy. He ordered the Praetorian Guard to prepare for field operations, a command that exposed the gap between the Guard's self-image and its actual capabilities. These were soldiers who had spent years manning checkpoints and marching in parades, their combat experience limited to the occasional urban riot or palace coup. The prospect of facing Severus's battle-hardened legions in open warfare generated something closer to panic than enthusiasm. Officers who had eagerly accepted Julianus's bribes now discovered urgent reasons why their units were not ready for deployment. The emperor attempted to fortify Rome itself, ordering the construction of defensive works and the stockpiling of supplies for a siege. Work crews were dispatched to strengthen gates, clear fields of fire, and prepare the ancient walls for a defense that no one seriously believed would occur. Rome had not faced a hostile army in centuries. The city's defenses were symbolic rather than practical, designed to impress visitors rather than repel invaders. Julianus was preparing to defend an indefensible position with troops who had no intention of fighting. In a move that captured both his desperation and his diminishing grip on reality, Julianus brought elephants into the city. The beasts had been used in Rome's entertainments for generations, maintained by the imperial household for spectacles and games. Now the emperor ordered them prepared for military service, apparently believing that the sight of war elephants would terrify Severus's legions into retreat. The soldiers who witnessed these preparations exchanged glances that required no translation. Their emperor was planning to fight the finest army in the empire with parade troops and circus animals. The Praetorians' morale collapsed in stages. First came the quiet conversations among centurions, calculating odds and considering alternatives. Then came the open grumbling, complaints about pay and conditions that carried undertones of political discontent. Finally came the passive resistance, orders acknowledged but not executed, positions manned but not fortified, weapons maintained but never quite ready for use. The Guard was not going to defend Julianus. They were simply waiting to see what terms Severus would offer. Julianus tried everything. He increased the promised donative, pledging amounts that had now passed from improbable to fantastical. He promoted officers who showed signs of loyalty, distributing titles and honors with the frantic generosity of a man watching his assets depreciate by the hour. He sent envoys to Severus offering negotiations, a power-sharing arrangement, a peaceful transition, anything that might preserve his life, if not his throne. The envoys were received politely and sent back with nothing. Severus had not marched 900 miles to negotiate. In late May, with Severus's army perhaps 2 weeks from Rome, Julianus made his most desperate gamble. He dispatched assassins, the speculatores, elite agents trained for precisely such missions, to infiltrate Severus's camp and eliminate the general before he could reach the capital. The plan depended on secrecy, speed, and the kind of operational competence that had characterized Roman intelligence services in better times. It failed on all counts. Severus's security protocols were too tight, his officers too vigilant, his personal guard too loyal. The assassins were captured before reaching their target. Their interrogation produced intelligence about Julianus's operations that Severus used to further demoralize the purchased emperor's remaining supporters. The attempted assassination transformed Severus from rebel to avenger. He now had personal cause to destroy Julianus, a blood debt that went beyond political competition to something more primal. His proclamations to the troops emphasized the emperor's treachery, his cowardice, his willingness to resort to poison and daggers when he could not win through legitimate means. The soldiers who heard these speeches needed little encouragement. They had already decided that Julianus deserved whatever was coming to him. As his military options evaporated, Julianus turned to darker methods. The ancient sources, admittedly hostile, report that he sought supernatural assistance in his final weeks, consulting sorcerers and participating in rituals designed to bind fate to his cause. Children were allegedly involved in sacrifices, their entrails examined for omens that might reveal how to escape the closing trap. Whether these accounts reflect actual events or represent the standard propaganda deployed against defeated emperors, they capture the atmosphere of those final days, a man abandoned by every rational source of support, grasping at magic because nothing else remained. The Senate watched these developments with the predatory patience of men who could smell political death. They had confirmed Julianus because Praetorian swords left them no choice. They would abandon him the moment those swords pointed elsewhere. Senators who had maintained careful neutrality now began making discreet contact with Severus's advancing headquarters, offering intelligence, promising support, positioning themselves for the transition everyone knew was coming. The chamber that had acclaimed Julianus emperor 6 weeks earlier was preparing to condemn him as a tyrant. Julianus's family shared his isolation. Manlia, Scantilla, and Didia Clara remained in the palace, prisoners of their titles, unable to flee without abandoning the man whose ambition had elevated them. Cornelius Repentinus, Julianus's son-in-law, found his position as city prefect increasingly meaningless. He commanded nothing, controlled nothing, merely occupied an office that would pass to Severus's appointee within days. The family that had celebrated their elevation to imperial status now waited in gilded rooms for soldiers to arrive and determine their fate. By the end of May, Severus had reached northern Italy. City after city opened its gates. Legion after legion declared for the approaching general. The trickle of defections became a flood as every officer and official in Italy calculated their survival odds and concluded that Julianus offered nothing worth dying for. The purchased emperor controlled Rome and nothing else, a single city, increasingly hostile, defended by soldiers who had already decided to switch sides. The final act approached. Severus was perhaps 100 miles away, his legions marching toward a capital that would not resist them. The Praetorians had received emissaries from the approaching army, promising amnesty for those who cooperated and punishment for those who didn't. The Senate was preparing its betrayal. The people had never accepted him in the first place. Didius Julianus, emperor of Rome, found himself alone in a palace full of servants who would not meet his eyes, surrounded by guards who were counting the days until their new employer arrived, ruling an empire that had never truly been his to rule. The auction's final settlement was about to come due. The end began with a meeting Julianus was not invited to attend. On the morning of June 1st, 193 AD, the Senate convened an emergency session. The Curia filled with men who had spent the previous 2 months maintaining careful neutrality, their togas freshly pressed, their expressions carefully calibrated to project righteous indignation rather than opportunistic betrayal. Severus's army was now camped at Interamna, barely 60 miles from Rome, close enough that his cavalry scouts had already been spotted on the outskirts of the city. The time for ambiguity had passed. The motion was simple: declare Didius Julianus a public enemy and offer the throne to Septimius Severus. No one rose to defend the emperor, not the colleagues who had dined at his table for 40 years, not the officials who had accepted his appointments, not even the senators who owed their positions to his patronage. The vote was unanimous and swift, a mirror image of the unanimous vote that had confirmed him 66 days earlier, the same men reaching the opposite conclusion with identical enthusiasm. The Senate had learned under generations of emperors that survival required flexibility, and they demonstrated their flexibility now with practiced efficiency. A delegation was dispatched immediately to Severus's camp, carrying the Senate's submission and its invitation to assume the purple. Another delegation was sent to the Praetorian camp with a more pointed message. The guard was ordered to surrender the men who had murdered Pertinax and to abandon their purchased emperor. The Senate, powerless for generations, had suddenly discovered its authority, or rather, had discovered that authority flows toward whoever commands the most legions. The Praetorians received the senatorial decree with something approaching relief. They had known for weeks that Julianus was doomed. Now they had official permission to complete his abandonment. The officers who had accepted his bribes, who had carried him through the camp on their shoulders, who had hailed him as Imperator Augustus, now assembled to discuss the most efficient method of transitioning to new management. Their primary concern was not loyalty to Julianus, but liability for Pertinax. The Senate had demanded the assassins, and the guard needed to decide who would be sacrificed to satisfy that demand. Julianus learned of the Senate's decree through messengers, whose haste betrayed their eagerness to distance themselves from his collapsing regime. The emperor who had purchased Rome found himself declared its enemy, stripped of his titles by the same body that had bestowed them, condemned without trial by men who had bowed to him that very morning. The legal fiction that had sustained his reign, the pretense that he was a legitimate ruler, confirmed through proper constitutional channels, had been revoked with a single vote. He summoned the Praetorian tribunes to the palace, hoping that personal appeal might succeed where institutional loyalty had failed. The meeting was a study in calculated disrespect. The officers arrived late. They stood when protocol demanded they sit. They answered his questions with monosyllables and his pleas with silence. When Julianus asked whether the guard would defend him against Severus's approaching army, the senior tribune present delivered the verdict with brutal simplicity. The Praetorians would not fight. The meeting ended without resolution, or rather, with the only resolution possible. Julianus dismissed the officers and found himself alone in an audience chamber designed to project imperial majesty, surrounded by empty chairs and silent slaves, and the accumulated symbols of a power that had evaporated so completely it might never have existed. He had perhaps hours left. He could flee, abandoning his family and his dignity in a desperate scramble for survival that would probably end with capture and execution anyway. He could fight, rallying whatever household troops remained loyal for a last stand that would accomplish nothing except turning his death from execution into battle casualty. Or he could wait, maintaining the pretense of imperial authority until someone arrived to remove him from it. He waited. The palace emptied around him with the quiet efficiency of rats leaving a sinking ship. Slaves who had prostrated themselves that morning disappeared into the city, taking whatever portable valuables they could carry. Officials who had administered his government discovered urgent business elsewhere. Guards who had protected his person found reasons to patrol distant corridors that happened to lead toward exits. Manlia Scantilla and Didia Clara remained, whether from loyalty, fear, or simple inability to conceive of alternatives, but even their presence offered no comfort. They sat together in chambers that had housed emperors for 2 centuries, listening to the sounds of abandonment echo through empty halls. The Praetorians sent a single soldier. The sources do not record his name or rank, only that he was dispatched from the camp to complete the transaction that had begun 66 days earlier. He found Julianus in the palace baths. Whether the emperor was bathing out of habit, denial, or deliberate choice to meet death in a civilized Roman manner, we cannot know. The soldier entered without ceremony. No words of accusation or justification have survived. Perhaps none were spoken. The blade did its work quickly, professionally, the efficient conclusion to a business arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. Didius Julianus died with a question on his lips that the ancient sources preserved, because it captured something essential about his tragedy. As the soldier approached, the emperor reportedly asked, "But what evil have I done? Whom have I killed?" The questions were not rhetorical. Julianus genuinely did not understand why he was dying. He had played the game of Roman politics by rules that had governed senatorial advancement for generations. He had cultivated patrons, accumulated wealth, pursued offices with patient determination, and seized opportunity when it presented itself. He had committed no massacres, ordered no proscriptions, indulged in none of the cruelties that had characterized emperors from Caligula to Commodus. By any conventional measure of Roman political morality, he had done nothing wrong. But the conventional measures no longer applied. Julianus had purchased power from men who had murdered their way to the ability to sell it, and in doing so had revealed something about Roman authority that could not be unrevealed. The throne was just a commodity. Legitimacy was just a story. The empire that claimed descent from gods and heroes was just a protection racket with better architecture. His crime was not cruelty but honesty. He had exposed the transaction that everyone preferred to keep hidden, and for that exposure he would pay with his life. The soldier withdrew. The body was left where it fell, attended eventually by slaves who had returned when the danger of being present no longer exceeded the danger of being absent. Manlia Scantilla and Didia Clara learned of the execution through whispers, their status transforming in an instant from imperial family to imperial survivors, women whose connection to the dead emperor made them objects of suspicion, but whose gender made them unlikely targets for immediate execution. Septimius Severus entered Rome 2 days later, acclaimed by Senate and people with the enthusiasm of subjects who had never supported the man they were replacing. The Praetorians who had sold the throne to Julianus were summoned to a field outside the city, ordered to appear without weapons or armor. Severus addressed them with the contempt they had earned, disbanded the guard entirely, and reconstituted it from his own legions. The men who had murdered Pertinax and auctioned the empire were cashiered in disgrace, forbidden to come within 100 miles of Rome. The body of Didius Julianus was released to his family for burial. He received no state funeral, no commemorative games, no monument to mark his reign. His wife and daughter survived, their lives spared by a Severus who calculated that killing widows generated worse publicity than the mild risk of leaving them alive. They disappeared into private life, their 66 days of imperial status becoming a family memory that subsequent generations would have every reason to forget. The auction was over. The price had been paid, and Rome moved on to its next crisis, as though the purchased emperor had never existed at all. The bathhouse where Didius Julianus spent his final moments was not one of Rome's grand public thermae, but a private facility within the palace complex, intimate, elegant, decorated with the mosaics and marbles that imperial taste demanded. Steam would have risen from heated pools. Slaves would have attended with oils and scrapers. The rituals of Roman bathing continued even as the empire changed hands outside the walls, because ritual was how Romans imposed order on chaos, and Julianus had spent 60 years mastering the rituals of his class. We cannot know what passed through his mind in those last hours. The sources, written by historians who served the dynasty that replaced him, had no interest in humanizing a man whose memory served better as a cautionary tale. But we can reconstruct the circumstances with reasonable confidence. Julianus knew the Senate had condemned him. He knew the Praetorians had abandoned him. He knew Severus was within a day's march of the city. The question was not whether his reign would end, but how, and whether he would be permitted any dignity in the ending. The bath may have been a choice. Roman aristocrats cultivated the art of dying well, and the warm water, the familiar surroundings, the continuation of civilized routine offered a kind of defiance that flight or resistance could not. Seneca had opened his veins in a bath. Petronius had done the same, drifting into death while conversing with friends about poetry and philosophy. If Julianus could not control his fate, he could at least control the setting, could meet his executioner as an emperor in his palace, rather than a fugitive dragged from some undignified hiding place. The soldier who arrived to kill him carried out orders that originated somewhere in the murky space between senatorial authority and Praetorian convenience. The Senate had declared Julianus a public enemy, which technically made his execution legal. The Praetorians wanted the matter concluded before Severus arrived, which made it expedient. No one recorded who gave the specific order, because no one wanted responsibility for killing an emperor, even an emperor. Everyone agreed needed to die. The execution itself was swift. A blade across the throat, perhaps, or a sword thrust to the chest. The sources do not specify, and Roman executions of this type were designed for efficiency rather than spectacle. Julianus's reported final words, "What evil have I done? Whom have I killed?" may be authentic or may be literary invention, the kind of quotation historians supplied when the dramatic moment demanded one. Either way, the words captured something true about the man and his end. He died confused, unable to reconcile the magnitude of his punishment with his understanding of his crimes. The body was removed from the palace without ceremony. No lying in state, no funeral procession through the Forum, no eulogies from the Senate that had condemned him hours before. The physical remains of Didius Julianus became an inconvenience to be disposed of, rather than an emperor to be mourned. His family was permitted to claim the corpse and arrange private burial, a mercy that may have reflected Severus's calculation that visible cruelty toward the dead would tarnish his own legitimacy more than it punished his predecessor. Manlia Scantilla and Didia Clara buried their husband and father somewhere outside the city, in a tomb that no ancient source bothered to locate. The women who had been Augusta, Empress of Rome, were now simply widows, wealthy enough to live comfortably, connected enough to avoid persecution, but stripped of every distinction that had briefly elevated them above their peers. Didia Clara's husband, Cornelius Repentinus, similarly faded into obscurity, his prefectures and appointments evaporating with the regime that had granted them. Septimius Severus entered Rome on June 9th, 193 AD, 8 days after Julianus's execution. The timing was not coincidental. Severus had deliberately slowed his advance to ensure that others performed the dirty work of regime change. He wanted to enter the capital as a liberator, not a conqueror, as the Senate's chosen emperor, not the commander who had marched on Rome with hostile legions. The purchased emperor had been conveniently removed before his replacement arrived, and Severus could claim clean hands in a transition that had been soaked in blood. The new emperor's first acts combined symbolic restoration with practical ruthlessness. He ordered a state funeral for Pertinax, the reformer whose murder had triggered the crisis, a ceremony that allowed Severus to position himself as the avenger of legitimate authority rather than another opportunist seizing power through force. He addressed the Senate with appropriate humility, promising to respect their privileges and govern through consultation, rather than autocracy. He distributed donatives to the people of Rome, purchasing the popular goodwill that Julianus had never obtained. But the Praetorian Guard received different treatment. Severus summoned them to a field outside the city under the pretense of a formal address from their new emperor. When they arrived, they found themselves surrounded by Severus's legions, the Danubian veterans who had marched 900 miles for exactly this moment. The guard was ordered to surrender their weapons, strip off their armor, and disperse. They were cashiered without severance, forbidden to approach within 100 miles of Rome, their careers and pensions forfeit. The institution that had murdered 2 emperors and auctioned the 3rd was dismantled in an afternoon. Severus reconstituted the guard from his own legions, filling its ranks with men whose loyalty he had tested over years of frontier warfare. The new Praetorians were larger in number, expanded from 10,000 to 15,000, but they were provincial soldiers, not Roman natives, with no institutional memory of the privileges their predecessors had enjoyed. The emperor was making a point that would echo through the remainder of Roman history. The guard served at imperial pleasure, and emperors who remembered their origins would not tolerate the arrangement that had allowed purchased power. The executions that followed were selective but emphatic. The soldiers who had actually struck the blows that killed Pertinax were identified, tried, and executed, a sacrifice to legitimacy that satisfied senatorial demands for justice without triggering a broader purge that might destabilize the military. Officers who had organized the auction were cashiered and exiled. The prefect Latus, who had orchestrated both Commodus's assassination and Pertinax's murder, was executed on charges that probably reflected his genuine crimes, but certainly reflected his inconvenient knowledge of how power actually changed hands in Rome. Julianus's memory received the treatment Rome reserved for emperors it wished to forget. His name was not formally subjected to damnatio memoriae, the official erasure that would have required chiseling his name from monuments and melting down his coins. But neither was it honored. No temples were dedicated to his deified spirit. No games commemorated his reign. The 66 days between Pertinax's murder and Julianus's execution became a gap in the official narrative, an embarrassment to be passed over quickly on the way to more edifying subjects. The purchased emperor had served his historical purpose. He had demonstrated, with terrible clarity, what happened when the mechanisms of legitimate succession broke down completely. He had provided Severus with a villain to replace and a crisis to resolve. And he had illustrated a truth about Roman power that no amount of subsequent propaganda could entirely obscure. The throne belonged to whoever could take it, and all the constitutional forms in the world were just decorations on a structure built from swords. Didius Julianus vanished into history's footnotes, remembered only for the manner of his elevation and the brevity of his fall. But the questions he asked with his dying breath, "What evil have I done? Whom have I killed?" lingered longer than his memory. They were the questions of a man who had followed the rules and discovered that the rules were a lie, who had played the game and learned too late that the game was rigged, who had bought an empire and received only a grave. In the end, that may have been his only lasting contribution, the demonstration that some purchases cost more than any buyer can afford. Septimius Severus had won Rome. Now he had to win the empire. The capital's submission meant nothing if the provinces remained in rebellion, and 2 rivals still commanded armies large enough to reverse everything Severus had achieved. Pescennius Niger controlled the east, 9 legions, the wealth of Syria and Egypt, the loyalty of populations who had acclaimed him emperor months before Severus reached Italy. Clodius Albinus held Britain's 3 legions and maintained his calculated ambiguity, neither fully committed to rebellion nor willing to submit. Severus had seized the center, but the periphery remained hostile, and Roman history offered abundant examples of emperors who had held Rome only to lose it to provincial challengers. The new emperor's strategic genius revealed itself in how he addressed the two-front problem. Niger was the immediate threat, closer, better funded, more popular, but attacking him would leave Severus's rear exposed to Albinus. A simultaneous war against both rivals would divide forces that were already stretched thin. Severus needed to neutralize one enemy before engaging the other, and he chose the method that had served ambitious Romans since the Republic. He lied. Envoys departed for Britain, carrying an offer that Albinus could not easily refuse. Severus proposed to adopt him as heir, granting him the title of Caesar and positioning him as successor to the imperial throne. The arrangement would give Albinus everything he wanted: recognition, legitimacy, the promise of eventual supreme power, without requiring him to risk his legions in a war whose outcome remained uncertain. In exchange, Severus asked only that Albinus remain in Britain while the Eastern rebellion was suppressed. Once Niger was defeated, the two men could rule as partners, father and son, in the constitutional fiction that Roman adoption created. Albinus accepted. Whether he believed Severus's promises or simply calculated that patience offered better odds than immediate conflict, he withdrew from the succession struggle and allowed the new emperor to concentrate his forces against Niger. The British legion stood down. The western provinces aligned behind Severus. The two-front war had become a one-front war, and the front pointed east. The campaign against Niger demonstrated why Severus's legions had carried him to power. The Danubian veterans who had marched on Rome now marched toward Syria, crossing into Asia Minor in late 193 and engaging Niger's forces in a series of battles that showcased superior discipline and generalship. Niger's eastern legions were formidable on paper, but they had spent years fighting Parthians rather than Romans, and their tactics were optimized for a different kind of enemy. Severus's commanders, men who had learned their trade on the Germanic frontier, adapted faster, maneuvered better, and exploited weaknesses that Niger's officers failed to anticipate. The decisive engagement came at Issus in 194 AD, the same narrow coastal plain where Alexander the Great had shattered the Persian Empire 5 centuries earlier. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Niger had positioned his army to block Severus's advance into Syria, anchoring his flanks on mountains and sea, confident that numbers and terrain would offset whatever advantages his enemies possessed. He was wrong. Severus's generals found the gaps, exploited the weaknesses, and turned Niger's defensive position into a killing ground. The Eastern army broke. Niger fled toward Antioch, then toward Parthia, hoping to find refuge beyond the imperial frontier. He never reached it. Severan cavalry caught him before he could cross into enemy territory, and his head was returned to the new emperor as proof of victory. The man who had been acclaimed savior of Rome by the eastern provinces died a fugitive, his rebellion crushed in less than a year, his supporters facing the choice between submission and destruction. Most chose submission. Severus was ruthless toward those who resisted, but pragmatic toward those who surrendered, understanding that dead enemies contributed nothing to the treasury while living subjects paid taxes. The east secured, Severus turned his attention to unfinished business in the west. Clodius Albinus had served his purpose, remaining neutral while Niger was destroyed. Now that neutrality became inconvenient. Severus had no intention of sharing power with a rival whose ambitions matched his own, and the fiction of adoption grew increasingly transparent as the months passed. Both men understood that their arrangement was temporary, a ceasefire rather than a peace, and both began preparing for its inevitable termination. The break came in 196 AD. Severus declared Albinus a public enemy, claiming that his adopted son had conspired against him. The charge may have been genuine. Roman politics generated conspiracies the way stagnant water generated mosquitoes. Or it may have been pretext. Either way, the result was the same: war. Albinus crossed the Channel into Gaul, gathering supporters among the provincial aristocracy who preferred his Italian breeding to Severus's African origins. The British legions marched with him, reinforced by recruits from Gaul and Spain, swelling his army to perhaps 150,000 men, the largest force assembled in the Western Empire since the civil wars of 69 AD. Severus met him at Lugdunum, modern Lyon, in February 197 AD. The battle that followed was the bloodiest single engagement of the entire civil war, a slaughter that left tens of thousands dead on a frozen field outside a city that would never fully recover from hosting such destruction. The fighting lasted an entire day, advantage shifting back and forth until neither army retained coherent formation. At one point, Severus himself was unhorsed and nearly killed, his bodyguard cut down around him, his survival depending on the desperate valor of officers who threw themselves between the emperor and Albinus's soldiers. Victory came through reserves that Severus had held back while Albinus committed everything. Fresh cavalry struck the exhausted rebels at the moment of maximum vulnerability, turning a contested battlefield into a rout. Albinus fled into Lugdunum and, recognizing that escape was impossible, took his own life rather than face capture. His head joined Niger's as a trophy of Severan triumph. The aftermath was savage. Severus executed 29 senators who had supported Albinus, confiscating their estates and redistributing the wealth to his own supporters. He purged the provincial administrations of anyone suspected of rebel sympathies. He punished Lugdunum itself, stripping the city of privileges and allowing his soldiers to plunder what the battle had spared. The message was unmistakable. Rebellion against Septimius Severus meant annihilation, not just for the rebel, but for everyone associated with him. By the spring of 197 AD, the year of 5 emperors was finally over. Pertinax, Julianus, Niger, and Albinus were all dead. Severus alone remained, master of an empire he had seized through speed, cunning, and a ruthlessness that his rivals had consistently underestimated. The purchased emperor was a fading memory, his 66-day reign reduced to a cautionary anecdote in the larger story of how one African general had outsmarted, outfought, and outlasted every competitor. Severus would rule for another 14 years, founding a dynasty that lasted until 235 AD, and transforming the Roman state in ways that would shape its remaining centuries. He professionalized the military, increased soldiers' pay, and allowed legionaries to marry legally, reforms that bound the army more closely to imperial authority, while acknowledging the reality that military force was the only foundation that mattered. He expanded the empire's frontiers, campaigning in Mesopotamia and Britain, dying at York in 201 AD while planning yet another war against the Caledonians. His final advice to his sons captured the lesson he had learned through years of civil war. Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. It was not the wisdom of philosophers or the counsel of statesmen. It was the conclusion of a man who had watched Didius Julianus buy an empire and lose it, who had understood that the transaction revealed something fundamental about how Rome actually worked. The soldiers were everything. The Senate was theater. The people were irrelevant. Power belonged to whoever paid the legions and held their loyalty. Julianus had understood half of this truth. He had paid, but he had purchased the wrong soldiers. Severus understood all of it, and he built a dynasty on the understanding. The auction of 193 AD was never repeated. But the lesson it taught, that Roman authority rested ultimately on military force and the willingness to use it, would echo through the remaining centuries of imperial history, growing louder with each succession crisis until the empire itself collapsed under the weight of armies that had learned too well how to make and unmake emperors. On a spring evening in 193 AD, a 60-year-old senator stood outside a military camp, and shouted numbers over a wall until the soldiers inside agreed to make him ruler of the known world. 66 days later, he died in a bathhouse, asking questions that no one bothered to answer. Between those two moments lies one of history's most compressed tragedies, a story of ambition, delusion, and the terrible clarity that comes when civilizations reveal what they actually are beneath the myths they tell about themselves. Didius Julianus is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as a punchline. The emperor who bought Rome, the fool who paid for a throne he could not keep. Historians mention him briefly on their way to more consequential figures: Severus, the dynasty founder; Caracalla, the citizen maker; the soldier emperors who would follow. Julianus occupies a paragraph between Pertinax's reforms and Severus's conquests, a cautionary tale deployed to illustrate what happens when institutions fail and ambition overreaches. He is the answer to a trivia question, not the subject of serious study. This is understandable, but unfair. Julianus was not a fool. He was a man of considerable ability who had navigated 4 decades of Roman politics with enough skill to reach the highest levels of senatorial achievement. He had governed provinces, commanded troops, survived the paranoid reign of Commodus when men of greater reputation had been destroyed. He understood how Roman power worked, the patronage networks, the careful cultivation of relationships, the patient accumulation of credentials that transformed provincial aristocrats into imperial candidates. By any reasonable measure, he was exactly the kind of man the Roman system was designed to produce: competent, connected, wealthy, and ambitious. His failure was not one of intelligence or preparation, but of imagination. Julianus could not see that the rules he had spent a lifetime mastering had already changed, that the auction in which he participated was not an opportunity but a symptom, not a path to power, but a revelation of power's collapse. The Praetorians who sold him the throne were not offering a transaction within the system. They were demonstrating that the system no longer existed. Legitimacy, tradition, constitutional propriety, these were fictions that required collective belief to maintain, and the guards' willingness to auction the purple proved that belief had evaporated. Julianus purchased an office that had already been emptied of everything except its dangers. The questions he asked as he died: "What evil have I done? Whom have I killed?" reveal a man still operating within the moral framework of traditional Roman politics. He had not been cruel. He had not been tyrannical. He had simply bought what was for sale, paid the asking price, and expected to receive the goods. By the standards of Caligula or Nero or Commodus, he was practically virtuous. His inability to understand why he was dying reflected his inability to understand that virtue was no longer the relevant metric. The new standard was simpler and more brutal: hold power or be destroyed by those who could. Septimius Severus understood this with perfect clarity. His advice to his sons, "Enrich the soldiers and scorn all other men," was not cynicism, but realism, the distilled wisdom of a man who had watched the auction and drawn the correct conclusions. The Senate was a rubber stamp. The people were a mob to be fed and entertained. The legions were everything, and an emperor's survival depended entirely on keeping them paid, promoted, and convinced that their fortunes were tied to his. Severus built a dynasty on this understanding, and his successors maintained power for 4 decades by following his prescription. But the prescription contained its own poison. Every emperor after Severus understood that the army was the source of power, which meant every emperor devoted increasing resources to military spending at the expense of everything else. Soldiers' pay rose while infrastructure crumbled. Frontier defense consumed revenues that might have funded economic development. The empire became a protection racket in which the protectors demanded ever larger payments while providing ever-diminishing security. The logic that Julianus's auction revealed, that power belonged to whoever would pay most for military support, became the operating principle of Roman government for the next 3 centuries. The 3rd century would vindicate this analysis with horrifying thoroughness. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome cycled through more than 50 emperors, most of them soldiers who seized power through military coup, and lost it the same way. The empire fragmented, reunified, fragmented again. Provinces were overrun by invaders, while legions fought each other for the right to acclaim their own candidates. The auction of 193 AD was never formally repeated, but its logic became the permanent condition of Roman politics, an endless series of transactions in which the throne went to whoever offered the best terms to the men with swords. Julianus's reign, then, was not an aberration, but a preview. He was the first emperor to acquire power through explicit purchase, but he would not be the last to hold it only through the continued willingness of soldiers to accept his payments. The difference between Julianus and his successors was merely one of transparency. He had bought the throne openly, while they maintained various fictions about divine selection, senatorial confirmation, or hereditary right. The underlying reality remained the same. Roman emperors ruled because armies let them rule, and the moment armies found better alternatives, emperors died. This is the true significance of the purchased emperor, not as a curiosity, but as a diagnostic. The auction of 193 AD revealed that Roman institutions had become hollow, that the elaborate constitutional machinery accumulated over 8 centuries of history was merely decorative, that the greatest empire the world had ever known rested on nothing more stable than the calculations of military self-interest. Other moments in Roman history are more dramatic. Other emperors left deeper marks on the historical record, but no single event exposed the empire's fundamental vulnerability more completely than the spectacle of 2 senators bidding against each other for the throne, while soldiers ran back and forth, comparing offers. The modern reader, surveying this wreckage from a distance of 18 centuries, might be tempted to draw comfortable conclusions about the uniqueness of Roman dysfunction. But the logic Julianus's story reveals is not limited to ancient empires. Institutions everywhere maintain their authority through some combination of genuine legitimacy and collective pretense. Constitutions work because people believe they work. Laws bind because citizens accept their binding force. The elaborate structures of governance that separate civilization from chaos are, in the end, agreements, and agreements can be broken when the parties no longer find them useful. What happens when soldiers decide to auction a throne? What happens when the guardians of order realize they can dictate terms to the institutions they supposedly serve? What happens when the formal mechanisms of legitimacy become disconnected from the actual distribution of power? These are not ancient questions. They are permanent questions, recurring wherever humans organize themselves into systems of authority, and wherever those systems grow brittle enough to break. Didius Julianus answered these questions with his life. He walked into an auction he did not understand, purchased power he could not wield, and died wondering what he had done wrong. His story is a tragedy in the classical sense. A man destroyed not by villainy, but by the gap between his understanding of the world and the world's actual operation. He played by rules that had already been discarded, paid prices that had already been invalidated, and learned too late that the game itself had changed while he was calculating his bid. The empire he briefly ruled would endure for another 3 centuries in the West, longer in the East. It would produce philosophers and tyrants, reformers and monsters, men who built and men who destroyed. But it would never again pretend that power flowed from anything other than the legions, never again maintain the comfortable fiction that constitutional forms determined who ruled and how. Julianus's auction had revealed the truth, and the truth once visible could not be unseen. In the end, perhaps that is his legacy. Not what he did with his 66 days of power, but what his elevation exposed about the nature of power itself. He bought an empire and received a corpse. He paid the highest price and got nothing for it. He achieved everything his family had worked toward for generations and discovered that the achievement was worthless. What evil had he done? Only this: he had believed that Rome was still what it claimed to be. And for that error of faith, he paid with everything he had.